Some dishes were made for survival, others for healing, and a few for rare moments of celebration. Today, many of these recipes are forgotten, hidden in manuscripts gathering dust. In this video, we're uncovering 25 lost monastery recipes, foods that carried both flavor and faith, and might just surprise you. In medieval Europe, monasteries were more than places of prayer, they were living archives. While kings ruled kingdoms and wars reshaped borders, monks worked quietly behind stone walls, copying manuscripts, tending gardens, and, most importantly, recording knowledge that might otherwise have vanished. Among these records were recipes, practical instructions for food, drink, and medicine that ensured survival in uncertain times. Why did monks preserve recipes so carefully? The answer lies in the very purpose of monastic life. Food was never seen as mere indulgence, but as a tool for devotion. Eating in moderation was considered a spiritual discipline, and meals were often tied to fasting calendars and liturgical rituals. By documenting recipes, monasteries ensured consistency and discipline across generations of monks, no matter how many centuries passed. Monks were also some of the best gardeners and agriculturalists of their time. They cultivated herbs, grains, and vegetables with scientific precision, noting which plants thrived in certain soils and which combinations offered both nourishment and healing. For instance, monastery recipes often blurred the line between food and medicine. A soup made with leeks and garlic wasn't only filling but thought to cleanse the blood, while honey-based tonics were prescribed for coughs. Recording these recipes in manuscripts meant that their dual role as nourishment and remedy would not be forgotten. Another reason monasteries preserved recipes was their role as centers of hospitality. Travelers, pilgrims, and even kings often found food and shelter within monastery walls. Preparing meals for such a diverse stream of visitors required both creativity and consistency. Recipes became a way to standardize hospitality, ensuring that a weary traveler in France or Italy could expect similar flavors of bread, cheese, and hearty stew. And then there is the cultural layer. During the chaos of the Middle Ages, many regions suffered from famine, plague, and war. Outside the cloisters, food traditions were often lost. Families displaced by conflict or disease could not always pass down recipes. But inside monasteries, the rhythm of life remained steady. The act of copying recipes into manuscripts was itself a way of preserving culture in a world of constant change. Finally, monasteries became knowledge bridges. As trade routes expanded, monks recorded new ingredients, spices from the East, citrus fruits from the Mediterranean, and integrated them into their recipes. Without their careful preservation, many of these flavor combinations might never have survived to influence later European cuisine. In short, monasteries preserved food knowledge not out of luxury, but necessity, to maintain health, discipline, hospitality, and continuity. The recipes they saved were not only instructions for cooking, but blueprints for survival and culture. And today, these manuscripts allow us to taste the Middle Ages, one dish at a time, that if you stepped into a medieval monastery kitchen, you might be surprised by how bustling and alive it was. Far from being silent halls of prayer alone, monasteries had entire wings dedicated to food preparation, and the kitchens were at the very heart of community life. At dawn, before the first bell for prayer, the kitchen would already be humming with activity. Fires were stoked, loaves of bread were placed into stone ovens, and large cauldrons of porridge or broth began to simmer. Monks followed a strict schedule, hours of prayer, study, labor, and meals, all carefully timed by bells. The kitchen was where these rhythms became tangible. Food preparation wasn't just about feeding hungry stomachs. It was part of spiritual discipline. Every step, from chopping vegetables to baking bread, was considered a form of service to God. Silence was often kept in the kitchen, allowing the labor itself to feel like a prayer. The ingredients monks used were simple, yet carefully chosen. Monastery gardens provided most of the essentials: onions, leeks, garlic, beans, peas, cabbages, herbs like sage and thyme, and grains such as barley and rye. Orchards grew apples, pears, and plums, which were dried for the winter months. Beekeeping was common, not just for honey but for wax to make candles. Monks were also skilled brewers, Beer and ale were safer to drink than water, and many monasteries became famous for their brewing traditions that still survive today. Meals were plain, but not without care. For breakfast, a monk might have bread with cheese and watered-down ale. Lunch, the main meal, was often soup or stew made with vegetables, sometimes enriched with fish. Meat was rarely served, since many monastic orders forbade it, though exceptions were made for the sick or for special feasts. Supper was light: bread, fruit, or another serving of broth. Cooking for dozens, sometimes hundreds, of monks was no small task. Large wooden tables were used for kneading dough, while giant iron pots hung over open hearths. Stone ovens baked round loaves that could feed the whole community. There were no precise measurements. Most recipes were memorized, with handfuls, pinches, and scoops guiding the way. When these recipes were written into manuscripts, they often read like poetic fragments. Take leeks, and boil with butter and sage. Add salt as the hand knows. But kitchens weren't only for monks. Monasteries were centers of charity, and feeding the poor was an essential duty. On feast days or during harvests, kitchens worked double, ensuring that food was distributed to the needy. This practice meant that monastery kitchens weren't hidden, private spaces. They were hubs of community life where the outside world and the cloistered life met. The kitchen also reflected the monastic value of sustainability. Nothing went to waste. Stale bread was turned into soups or puddings, vegetable scraps into broths, and even bones, if allowed, were boiled to extract every ounce of flavor. Wastefulness was considered a sin, so efficiency in the kitchen was a moral as well as a practical requirement. Perhaps the most fascinating detail about monastery kitchens is their sense of order and cleanliness. In a world where many villages struggled with sanitation, monasteries enforced strict rules about cleanliness in food preparation. Utensils were washed, water was boiled, and herbs were used not just for flavor, but also for their medicinal and preservative qualities. This discipline allowed monasteries to withstand famines and plagues better than many communities around them. In the evenings, after the final prayers, the kitchen fires were banked, and the smell of wood smoke and roasted bread lingered in the air. For the monks, the day's work of feeding body and soul was complete. What might look to us like humble meals were, for them, sacred rituals of sustenance. Daily life in monastery kitchens was not glamorous, but it was rich in meaning. It was here that faith met necessity, where recipes became traditions, and where the simple act of sharing bread embodied centuries of devotion and discipline. In monasteries, food was never just food. Each ingredient carried spiritual weight, linking the body's nourishment to the soul's devotion. When monks prepared meals, they weren't only feeding themselves. They were honoring centuries of tradition where even the humblest grain could hold sacred meaning. Bread, for example, was the most symbolic of all foods. More than daily sustenance, it was tied directly to the Eucharist, the sacred ritual of communion. Every loaf baked in monastery ovens carried echoes of Christ's body, and so the act of baking bread became almost liturgical. Recipes for monastery bread were simple: flour, water, salt, and yeast. Yet the ritual of kneading and sharing it elevated the ordinary into the holy. Wine also played a dual role, both as a sacrament and as a staple. While wine was reserved for Mass, monasteries often produced it in large quantities, with vineyards carefully tended by brothers who saw in each grape the potential for spiritual transformation. In regions where grapes couldn't grow, ale and beer became their counterparts, safer than water, hearty enough to sustain fasting monks, and often crafted with herbs believed to hold healing powers. Herbs themselves carried deep symbolism. Sage was thought to bring wisdom, thyme to protect the spirit, and rosemary to sharpen memory. Monastic gardens were more than food sources, they were spiritual pharmacies. Monks believed that cultivating herbs was a way of cooperating with God's natural order, preserving health not only for their community, but for the pilgrims and poor they cared for. Fish, too, held sacred significance. Since meat was restricted in many orders, fish became the chosen substitute. Its connection to Christian symbolism, the ichthyes, or fish, as a secret sign of faith, made it doubly meaningful. On fasting days, monks would eat salted or preserved fish, connecting their physical hunger with spiritual discipline. Even the humblest ingredients carried meaning. Lentils and beans, staples of the monastic diet, represented humility and endurance. Honey symbolized spiritual sweetness, the promise of God's word. Apples, often grown in monastery orchards, were reminders of Eden, symbols of both temptation and divine provision. The very act of fasting also turned food into a spiritual lesson. To deny rich flavors was to tame desire, but to eat simply was to honor God's creation. In that way, even porridge made from barley or rye became a sacred act of balance between body and spirit. To us today, these ingredients might seem plain, even austere. But to the monks, each taste, each meal, each shared loaf was a reminder that food was more than survival. It was a symbol, a link between heaven and earth, a daily opportunity to weave faith into flesh. Point 1. Monastic barley porridge. Barley was the humble grain of survival, cheap and filling. Monks simmered it with water, salt, and a few herbs from the cloister gardens, creating a thick porridge eaten during fasting seasons. Though plain, it carried spiritual meaning, endurance through simplicity. As wheat rose in status and diets modernized, barley was dismissed as peasant food, and this monastic staple vanished from everyday kitchens. 2. Lentil and herb stew. Lentils, rich in protein, were a cornerstone of the monastery diet. Slow-cooked with onions, garlic, sage, and thyme, this stew warmed cold stone refectories on winter nights. It symbolized humility, nourishing but unadorned. Today, lentils survive, but the quiet, herb-heavy monastic style has been replaced by spiced global versions, leaving the old recipe buried in manuscripts. 3. Monks' black bread. Baked with coarse rye and bran, black bread was dense, chewy, and sustaining. It was blessed before being divided among the brothers, turning a simple meal into an act of devotion. Its bitterness contrasted with the sweetness of wheat bread, reinforcing the monastic lesson of humility. As refined flour became accessible, the rough loaves of the cloisters disappeared from common use. 4. Honey mead. Fermented honey drinks were cherished in monasteries, both medicinal and celebratory. Mead was believed to strengthen the body and warm the spirit during feast days. Recipes recorded proportions of honey, herbs, and water, sometimes flavored with rosemary. With the decline of monastic brewing traditions and the rise of commercial alcohol, mead became a relic of the past, surviving only in niche revivals. 5. Herb-infused cheese. Monasteries often raised goats and sheep, producing simple cheeses flavored with parsley, sage, or chives. These cheeses were soft, tangy, and eaten with dark bread. Each region's recipe differed slightly, recorded in local manuscripts. As industrial cheesemaking took over, these handcrafted herb cheeses largely disappeared, remembered only in rural traditions. 6. Spelt flatbread. Spelt, an ancient grain, was cultivated in monastery fields and baked into thin flatbreads. These were often served with soups or dipped in olive oil when available. Their nutty flavor gave them a unique character. With wheat becoming the dominant grain, spelt fell out of favor, and these flatbreads became a forgotten relic of medieval diets. 7. Fish stew. With leeks on fasting days, monks relied on fish. A common recipe combined river fish with leeks, parsley, and broth, slow-cooked over open hearths. It was both hearty and symbolic, tying into Christian fish symbolism. Today, it survives only in fragments of regional cooking, far from the central role it once held in cloisters. 8. Chestnut bread. In forested regions, chestnuts were ground into flour to create bread when grain was scarce. Its sweet, earthy taste made it beloved in poorer monasteries. Chestnut bread represented resilience and resourcefulness. As chestnut trees declined from disease and wheat became abundant, this unique bread faded from daily life. 9. Pottage of cabbage and peas. A thick vegetable pottage made with peas, cabbage, and onions was a daily staple in many monasteries. It was simmered for hours, becoming almost stew-like, and eaten communally from shared bowls. While it filled bellies, it also embodied the monastic spirit of simplicity. Modern palates turned toward richer, faster meals, pushing such humble porridges into obscurity. 10. Almond milk broth. Monks often substituted almond milk for dairy during fasting periods. Almonds were ground and strained into a creamy liquid, mixed with herbs or rice for a nourishing broth. It was both nutritious and symbolic of restraint. As dairy became cheaper and more available, this plant-based tradition vanished, centuries before almond milk made a modern comeback. 11. Garlic and leek paste. Herbs and alliums were medicine as much as food. Monks crushed garlic, leeks, and olive oil into a paste spread on bread. Strong, pungent, and restorative, it was believed to fight illness. This rustic spread disappeared with the decline of herbal medicine, though echoes remain in modern garlic dips. 12. Monastic beer brewing was an essential skill in monasteries, both for income and sustenance. Their beer was hearty, cloudy, and flavored with herbs before hops became standard. It was safer than water and sustained monks through fasting. As industrial breweries rose, the herbal character of monastic beer vanished, though some abbey traditions still cling on. 13. Roasted root medley. Turnips, parsnips, carrots, and beets were roasted in monastery ovens with salt and herbs. This simple dish was often reserved for feast days, as roasting required more fuel than boiling. It symbolized abundance in its own humble way. Today, it feels almost too plain for modern tastes, overshadowed by rich sides and sauces. 14. Apple and honey cakes. Monastery orchards often grew apples, which were stewed with honey and baked into dense cakes. These were offered on special occasions like saints' feast days. Sweet but rustic, they symbolized divine blessing. As sugar spread and baking became more refined, these dense cakes faded into obscurity. 15. Spiced lentil fritters. Lentils were sometimes ground and fried into patties flavored with pepper and cloves, offering a rare taste of spice in austere diets. They were eaten during fasting as a satisfying substitute for meat. Over time, as frying became less associated with monastic restraint, the fritters vanished. 16. Monks' onion soup. Onions were grown widely and boiled into simple broths thickened with stale bread. This soup was comforting, cheap, and sustaining, eaten by both monks and travelers seeking refuge. The later French onion soup has echoes of this, but the original monastic version is all but forgotten. 17. Rye pancakes made with rye flour, water, and eggs. These pancakes were dense and filling. They were eaten during harvest celebrations or shared with pilgrims. Their heaviness made them less appealing compared to refined wheat pancakes, and so they slipped away from culinary memory. 18. Vinegar stew. In times of scarcity, monks cooked greens and beans in vinegar broth. Sour and austere, it symbolized both survival and humility. It was less about flavor and more about discipline. Modern palates abandoned it quickly, but manuscripts still mention its role in times of want. 19. Hazelnut pottage. Hazelnuts, gathered from monastery lands, were ground into a porridge mixed with barley or oats. It provided rare richness in the otherwise simple diet. As nut cultivation waned, this dish slipped away, remembered only in texts. 20. Pickled turnips. Preservation was key to monastery life. Turnips were pickled in brine, garlic, and herbs, stored in barrels for winter. Their sharp taste cut through plain porridges. With modern refrigeration, the labor of pickling was abandoned, erasing these old methods. 21. Rosewater rice. Putting. Imported ingredients like rice and rosewater found their way into monastic feasts through trade. Combined with honey, it became a delicacy for special occasions. Over time, sugar-based desserts replaced this floral, fragrant pudding. 22. Herb omelets. Eggs mixed with parsley, thyme, and leeks created a fragrant, fluffy dish often eaten after Lent. It marked the joy of returning to richer foods. Industrial farming later redefined omelets, leaving the simple monastic version in the past. 23. Monastic mustard. Monks crushed mustard seeds with vinegar and honey to create a sharp condiment, both medicinal and culinary. It accompanied breads and fish dishes. Today's mustard owes them its roots, but their original rustic blends are rarely seen. 24. Dandelion greens. Salad. Young dandelion leaves were gathered in spring, tossed with oil, vinegar, and herbs. This bitter, cleansing salad symbolized renewal. Though dandelion greens survive in niche health trends, The monastic version is largely forgotten. 25. Fasting almond pastries during Lent. Monks sometimes baked simple pastries with almond flour and honey. Light, delicate, and symbolic of restraint, they satisfied sweet cravings without breaking fasting rules. As refined pastries spread, these austere treats disappeared. Within the worn pages of medieval manuscripts, the recipes are more than instructions for food. They are fragments of life inside cloistered walls. Each dish carried with it a story, a ritual, or a reminder of the discipline that defined monastic living. To the monks, food was never just about filling the stomach. It was a spiritual practice, bound by rhythm, prayer, and humility. Take, for example, the story of Brother Thomas, a 14th-century cook in a Benedictine monastery. He is remembered not for sermons, but for his pottage. The brothers wrote that he stirred his cauldrons while whispering psalms, believing the words infused the food with grace. His cabbage and pea stew was described as a meal that warmed the soul as much as the body. Today, that humble dish is gone, but the memory of his devotion lingers in the manuscripts. Another tale speaks of fasting seasons, when the rules of abstinence demanded creativity. Meat and dairy were forbidden for long stretches, so cooks turned to almond milk and herbs. Manuscripts recall how young novices marveled the first time they tasted almond broth, creamy, nutty, and unlike anything else in their simple diet. It was not indulgence, but an expression of discipline and ingenuity. The orchard stories are equally rich. In one monastery, apples were so central to the diet that a record tells of a single ancient tree, tended with reverence by generations of monks. Its fruit-flavored honey cakes and ciders used in feast days. That tree was seen as a blessing, and losing it to a storm was recorded with more grief than the loss of silverware or books. Then there are the tales of scarcity, when failed harvests pushed monasteries to invent foods from what little they had. Chestnut bread and vinegar stews came from these desperate times. Yet, instead of despair, the manuscripts speak of gratitude. Meals that tasted sour or bitter were reframed as spiritual reminders of endurance. Each story reveals that monastery recipes were not only about ingredients, but about meaning. They carried the essence of community, resilience, and faith. When we rediscover these forgotten foods, we are not simply uncovering flavors of the past. We are tasting the devotion of those who lived in quiet service centuries ago. If monastery recipes were so meaningful, why do we no longer eat them today? The answer lies in history's slow but steady march of change. First came the Reformation and secularization of many monasteries across Europe. When cloisters were dissolved or abandoned, their kitchens went silent. Recipes once preserved by monks and scribes were left to gather dust in forgotten libraries. Without the daily rhythm of monastic cooking, the food simply faded from cultural memory. Then, industrialization reshaped eating habits. By the 18th and 19th centuries, people turned to mass-produced bread, sugar, and processed ingredients. Dishes like pea pottage or chestnut bread seemed too plain, too tied to hardship. In contrast, new foods represented progress and prosperity. The old recipes, associated with frugality, were quietly pushed aside. Another factor was changing taste preferences. Monastery food was intentionally simple, designed to nourish but not excite. Modern society, however, began craving richer, bolder flavors. Almond broth or vinegar stews couldn't compete with the indulgence of chocolate cakes, buttered meats, and sweet puddings. Finally, many of these recipes disappeared because they were never meant for the masses. They belonged to a cloistered world where food was spiritual discipline, not culinary adventure. Once that world diminished, the recipes lost their purpose. Today, when we uncover them in manuscripts, they feel like relics from a parallel universe, flavors of a faith-driven lifestyle that no longer exists. When monastery recipes vanished, it wasn't just food that disappeared. It was a way of living, a rhythm of culture, and a philosophy of nourishment. To truly grasp the loss, we have to look beyond the bowls and loaves and into the spirit of the cloisters. First, we lost a sense of food as devotion. For monks, every meal was an act of discipline and gratitude. Eating slowly, in silence, or while listening to scripture turned ordinary bread into a sacred ritual. Compare that with today's hurried snacks in front of screens, where food is fuel rather than reflection. The monastery table asked people to pause, to savor, and to find holiness in something as simple as cabbage soup. We also lost seasonal wisdom. Monastic cooking was deeply tied to the cycles of nature. Chestnuts in autumn, peas in spring, herbs at their freshest. These recipes mirrored the turning of the year. Industrial agriculture broke this cycle, replacing it with out-of-season produce shipped across oceans. The patience and balance of eating what the land offered, when it offered it, slowly vanished. Another quiet loss was communal eating. Meals in monasteries weren't about personal choice or picky preferences. They were shared experiences. Everyone, from abbot to novice, ate from the same pot. That unity around the table created bonds that went deeper than taste. Today, food has become highly individualized, customized menus, fast food orders, diet plans, and we rarely experience the kind of collective nourishment that monks knew daily. There's also the cultural memory that slipped away. Recipes carried stories, values, and resilience. Pea stew wasn't just food. It was centuries of adaptation to poverty, humility, and survival. When such dishes vanish, the memory of those struggles and virtues fades too. We inherit less wisdom about how food sustained communities through famine, plague, or war. Lastly, what disappeared was a balance between body and soul. Modern food culture swings between extremes, indulgence on one side, dieting obsession on the other. Monastery food lived in the middle, modest, nourishing, intentional. It taught that food could sustain without enslaving, that hunger could be satisfied without excess. That middle ground, too, is something we rarely see today. In short, losing these recipes meant losing an entire worldview. They remind us that food was never just about taste. It was about time, memory, discipline, and belonging. To rediscover them isn't only about cooking old dishes. It's about recovering forgotten ways of living. At first glance, monastery recipes may seem like relics of another world. Simple pea stews, coarse bread, and herbal infusions that don't fit the glossy, Instagram-ready plates of today. But in truth, the world may be more ready than ever to welcome them back. One reason is the farm-to-table movement. Chefs and home cooks are rediscovering the power of local, seasonal ingredients, the very heart of monastic cooking. Imagine reviving an ancient turnip and barley soup at a modern restaurant, not as a curiosity, but as a genuine reminder that humble ingredients can create deep, comforting flavors. The popularity of rustic sourdough bread in recent years is already proof that people crave food that feels grounded in tradition. There's also growing interest in slow living and mindful eating. Where the modern world rushes, monasteries lingered. Cooking was unhurried. Eating was deliberate. People today, overwhelmed by fast food and fast schedules, are hungry for that balance. A monastery-inspired diet, rich in legumes, vegetables, whole grains, and herbs, could resonate with those seeking wellness without fads. It's not a new health trend, but an old one, rooted in centuries of wisdom. Another possibility lies in sustainability. Monastic kitchens were models of frugality and low waste. Leftovers became tomorrow's meal. Herbs were foraged rather than imported. Preservation methods like drying and pickling reduced spoilage. In an age where food waste is one of the biggest global problems, these lessons feel urgently relevant. Reviving monastery recipes is not just nostalgic, it's ecological. We can also see a comeback through storytelling and heritage cooking. Food isn't only about taste, it's about meaning. Imagine cooking an old lentil stew and telling your family that this was the very kind of dish that carried communities through plagues and winters 600 years ago. That context transforms a bowl of beans into a living history lesson. As more people look for cultural connection in their food, monastery recipes could offer just that, a bridge to our ancestors. And then there are the chefs and content creators. From YouTube food historians to Michelin-starred innovators, cooks love to rediscover and reinvent forgotten dishes. We're already seeing medieval pies, Roman garum, and Viking bread gaining new audiences. Monastery food could easily join that revival, earthy, humble, but reimagined with a modern twist. A chickpea stew doesn't have to look plain. Plated with care, it could become a star. So, could these recipes make a comeback? Absolutely. Not because they're trendy, but because they meet timeless human needs: nourishment, simplicity, and meaning. If the future of food is about reconnecting with the past, monastery kitchens may once again inspire how we eat, not just what we eat. When we look back at the recipes tucked away in monastery manuscripts, we realize they were never just about food. They were about ritual, survival, and devotion. Each loaf of coarse bread, each simmering pot of beans, was both nourishment for the body and a symbol of discipline for the soul. Today, in a world where meals often flash by in minutes, these forgotten dishes invite us to slow down, to cook with patience, and to eat with meaning. We've traveled through cloisters and kitchens, through pages inked by candlelight, and through the quiet wisdom of monks who believed that food was sacred. And along the way, we've discovered that these recipes are not really gone. They've simply been waiting for us to notice them again. The question is not whether they could make a comeback, but whether we are ready to embrace them. Ready to taste simplicity in a world drowning in excess. Ready to reconnect with traditions that remind us who we are and how far we've come. So perhaps the next time you knead dough or stir a pot of soup, you'll remember, somewhere, centuries ago, hands just like yours were doing the same thing. Not for fame, not for money, but for the quiet joy of keeping life going. Food is memory. Food is identity. And some recipes are simply too important to stay forgotten. Which of these ancient monastery recipes would you want to try first? So perhaps the next time you knead dough or stir a pot of soup, you'll remember, somewhere, centuries ago, hands just like yours were doing the same thing. Not for fame, not for money, but for the quiet joy of keeping life going. Food is memory. Food is identity. And some recipes are simply too important to stay forgotten. Which of these ancient monastery recipes would you want to try first? And some recipes are simply too important to stay forgotten. Which of these ancient monastery recipes would you want to try first?